The Doctor, Season 14, Chapter 1, The Definite Article, Part 1, by Alexander Leiths. The Doctor stood on the vast sand-strewn open space of Cairo Aerodrome. Cairo was one of the inner worlds of the habitable planets in the Upsilon Orionis system, at least spatially speaking. In terms of power and influence, political, industrial, and military, the planet Albia currently occupied the center of this star system. The most obvious reminder of this domination was the imposing cylinder of the A-36 airship floating overhead, a commercial spaceship of the Albion Imperial Space Service. Its nose was tethered to a mooring mast, which contained a lift providing access to the ship itself. At the other end of this vessel, its vast tail fins sported the concentric blue, white, and red circles of Albia, the powerhouse of this region of space. Due to accidents of the system's chemistry, possibly influenced by historical contact with higher dimensions, the Albion or Cairoan civilization had an unusually low level of technology for a spacefaring race. Through further historical accidents, the system and its people had also been unduly influenced by Earth culture and history, even though no human had ever set foot on these worlds. The combined result of this compounded serendipity was a culture with the aesthetics and technology roughly similar to that of the first half of the 20th century on Earth. The Doctor breathed in the warm, dusty late morning air and looked around at all before him, smiling in satisfaction. He absolutely loved the place. The Doctor and Romana had said their final farewells to their Albion friends, Lou Halberd and Nathan Ivon, PI, before those individuals had headed off into Abydos, the ancient capital of Cairo. For one thing, they had to check up on their third companion, Timmy Cowley, currently recovering from a serious injury in the Abydos Imperial Hotel under the very best private medical care. Secondly, they had to report back to Sir Arthur Buchan at the Albion Imperial Museum, and by extension the Albion authorities. They had many rum-doings to disclose. The TARDIS doors creaked open behind the Doctor, and out trundled K9, closely followed by Romana. The Doctor frowned when he saw her. "You've regenerated," he cried accusingly, and not a little shocked. Romana returned his frown, her own tinged with a little impatience. "Don't be ridiculous," she snorted back at her fellow Time Lord. "I just changed my hairstyle, and not by much either. I must say I'm surprised you noticed, uncharacteristically observant of you. I certainly didn't expect you to think I'd regenerated. We neither of us are beyond changing our outfit and adornment slightly from time to time, and we don't need to burn a regeneration just for appearance's sake." The Doctor shook his head in mild irritation at this admonishment. Nevertheless, he could not quite keep the corners of his mouth from twitching. "Of course, naturally, and there's absolutely no precedent set for such behavior." Romana huffed impatiently back at the Doctor, but there was a twinkle to her eyes as she slapped the Doctor's shoulder with the back of her hand. "Master, Mistress, I await your instructions," K9 chipped in, almost as if impatient to be on the move. Romana and the Doctor turned to regard him curiously, each a little surprised by the interruption. "K9!" the Doctor exclaimed happily. "What's the matter, boy? Do you need a walk?" K9 whirred and chattered for a moment. "Master, I merely wondered where our next destination would be, and whether my services would be required." The Doctor smiled indulgently at the robot dog. "Oh, K9, I'm not sure what special tasks our next destination may have in store for you, but isn't that always the way?" "Affirmative, Master," K9 interjected, a little quickly. The Doctor frowned at what had sounded almost like a criticism, before brushing it aside and continuing. "As to the nature of that location in space and time, I do have an idea, but I would like to hear Romana's opinion first." Romana's eyes widened a little at the Doctor's unusual bout of consideration. Nevertheless, she could not resist a little dig. "I must say I'm surprised you didn't accuse K9 of regenerating. After all, he does seem to have endured a little makeover of his own." With this, she waved a hand towards the metal dog. Before K9 had reappeared outside the TARDIS, he had been wearing the doctor's old scarf, wrapped several times around his body, and the chrome crown-like accoutrement of the FDSS, the four-dimensional stress set. Although the scarf remained, the multi-dimensional space-time Swiss Army knife device was now missing. The doctor shook his head impatiently. What must you think of me, to imagine I could ever consider such a thing happening to a non-Gallifreyan, let alone a robot? Anyway, I was the one that removed the FDSS in the first place. Both the exterior and interior components installed into K9. Hopefully, such a device will never see the light of day again. Romana cocked her head at him. Did you finally destroy it? The doctor frowned. Not exactly. I put it deep in a drawer in the TARDIS, out of sight and out of mind. Romana looked a little dubious. Didn't you say that the whole reason you disassembled it in the first place was because it was too powerful, dangerous, and tempting a device to have around? We have already seen the damage it can cause in the wrong hands. The doctor nodded grimly. Which is why we should never be tempted to use it again, and therefore it should be safe enough. However, we have seen occasions in the recent past where it helped stall, or even reverse, damage to our universe. And we know there are individuals and entities out there who could threaten the fabric of space and time, the whole of existence, if left unchecked. So better to have it for safekeeping, ours and the universe. Romana nodded her slow acceptance of his point. Anyway, the doctor continued more cheerily, didn't you want to hear my suggestion? I'm all ears, Doctor, Romana said good-naturedly. Nonsense, Romana, the doctor said in some confusion. That was your second incarnation. Then he smiled as his mind returned to his intended destination. I was thinking of somewhere I have never actually visited, and yet have a friend there. I am speaking of Alpha Centauri. Romana considered the name thoughtfully, the ears comment already forgotten. That's a trinary system, isn't it? The doctor nodded enthusiastically. Exactly, that's where he is, on the planet of Alpha Centauri Prime, orbiting Alpha Centauri A, naturally. Romana nodded sagely. That's an awful lot of Alpha Centauri. I imagine it could get quite confusing. The doctor chuckled. Not for the likes of you or I, I'm sure, and the locals seem to cope well enough. No doubt, she agreed cautiously. And you say you have never been there. That truly is a galactic wonder. The doctor pursed his lips at Romana, a little peeved. Romana, there are 10 to the 11 stars just in this galaxy alone, and at least 10 to the 11 galaxies in the universe. I haven't quite exhausted them all yet. Romana gave a smug little smile at his irritation. Its proximity to the Earth and that system does make your overlooking it a tad more unusual, but let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. Onwards to Alpha Centauri. With these final words, Romana gestured to the TARDIS doors. The doctor nodded in good-natured acquiescence, but was then distracted by something over his companion's shoulder, standing on the dusty landing field some 30 yards away. It was the figure of a Chiron woman in long black robes. They completely covered her from head to foot. Even her face was largely concealed by a scarf of the same material. Only the odd strand of dark brown hair escaped from the edges of her turban, coupled with two dark eyes staring intently into his own. An eerie, warbling, wailing melody enveloped him as he stared back at her. Then he noticed a small shack nearby, just to the side of the line formed by all the spaceport's mooring masts. It was a hastily constructed modest temple to Osiris, erected for the use of the native Chiroan workers keen to observe their daily religious obligations. What is it, Doctor? Romana asked, turning her head to follow his gaze. The doctor shook himself. Just a curious local, he said dismissively, smiling at his foolishness. No matter how odd he found that stare, there was ultimately nothing unexpected there. We must make quite a spectacle, he continued. After all, we surely look human to them, and they will only have seen that species through images in their ancient Encyclopedia Britannica. To some of them it must almost be like history, or legends, come to life. Romana gave a chuckle. Angels walking from the Bible, she noted sardonically. The doctor shook his head but also chuckled. Now, you know as well as I that neither of us are angels. Now let us finally away to new adventures. Affirmative, 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 K9 chipped in excitedly. The doctor frowned down upon him. I wasn't talking to you, he told the dog gruffly. Nevertheless, he then allowed K9 and Romana to enter the TARDIS ahead of him before taking one final look round at Cairo. The doctor walked through the doors, and they closed behind him. The TARDIS made its uncertain entrance to the advanced metropolis of City Alpha 1, dithering habitually before finally settling on arrived. The scruffy blue box did look a little out of place on the wide and immaculate street in which it now stood. From the oddly conical towers, through the sweeping elevated causeways and ramps which curved around and between them, down to the surface of the very road they were now on, all was clearly fashioned from durable high-tech materials, possibly self-cleaning to judge from their condition. The city itself might have appeared a little small to earthly expectations, particularly for a capital city, being home to just over 100,000 residents and workers, but such low population densities were typical for the long-lived inhabitants of Alpha Centauri Prime. City Alpha 1 sat in the southern hemisphere of its home planet, although hugging the edge of its equatorial region, straddling the transition between jungle to the south and arid dune-filled desert to the north. The only slight imperfection to mar the pristine streets of the city was dust blown in from that sandy northern zone. The doors of the TARDIS whirred open, and through them strode the Doctor, Romana, and K9. Well, trundled in the case of K9. The two Time Lords blinked as they stared around them in the bright midday rays of Alpha Centauri A, breathing deeply of the hot and dusty air. Out of the frying pan, into the fire, Romana observed as she wafted her face with her hand, a little theatrically. Well, I have never been here before. I had no idea we'd be so close to yet another desert, the Doctor said somewhat defensively. Then his finger jabbed southwards, downhill from where they were standing. And look, there's jungle over there. I seem to recall some fascinating facts about that region. Looking across the city in that direction, it was indeed possible to make out a dense vine-covered forest of unusual trees. The colours therein were more varied than most forests on Gallifrey or Earth. Blues, purples and reds scattered in among the more familiar greens, browns and silvers. But many of these trees had odd forms. One particular variety were odd, rubbery-looking cones, or single stalks rising up among the more usual leafy foliage. Romana inclined her head slowly in cautious acceptance of his defence. Yes, that at least looks a little more out of the ordinary, she conceded. Then she frowned as her brain fully registered the local inhabitants visible nearby. I must say that the people are something of a surprise too. I was expecting something smaller and more furry. Those people were definitely not humanoid. Their hides were various shades of green and seemed more like an insect's carapace than skin, rigid, or at the very least semi-rigid. The body was sectioned and sported pairs of legs or arms, 4 sets in total. The upper pairs acted as arms, while the lowest twins formed the creature's legs. The uppermost portion of this alien was its huge globular head, a head which was marked with prominent veins and dominated by a single sizable eye. Ah, the Doctor said knowingly, a slight smile creeping into his features. You are thinking of the boloids, the small furry creatures of legend also native to this planet. These are the Chitids, who share dominion over Alpha Centauri Prime. Here the Doctor paused and looked a little uncertain. Admittedly, there do seem to be mostly Chitids here in the city at the moment. It was originally built by them, I believe. The boloids prefer to live deeper in the jungle itself. Oh, wait, look, there's a boloid just over there. With this last statement, the Doctor pointed excitedly through the growing throng of Chitids around them. That race were on average not much shorter than humans or Gallifreyans. The considerably shorter boloid was difficult to see among the taller citizens, but finally Romana also spotted it. A blue, furry shape, perhaps 1.5 meters tall when standing, striding through the crowd on 2 spindly-looking arms or legs, terminating in enormous hands or feet. The confusion as to how exactly these appendages should be named stemmed from the fact that these were the only 2 limbs the creature owned. Their armpits were high on the creature's head at around where one might expect ears, possibly even higher. Its yellow beak of a mouth looked like a small trumpet bell, while above this 2 circular eyes glowed like yellow headlights. The boloid walked on out of sight. Now it was Romana's turn to nod sagely. Ah, so there are 2 intelligent species on Alpha Centauri Prime. Unusual, but there are several instances where such peaceful coexistence succeeds in the universe. The Doctor's smile returned. 3, actually, although there is some question as to the final species' actual intelligence. They are often regarded by the Chitids and boloids as semi-sentient, while they in their turn tend to keep to themselves within their own close-knit communities, high in the jungle canopy. I refer, of course, to the chirpers. Romana frowned at the Doctor. The Sherpas? She said questioningly. You don't mean as in those Earthmen famous for their climbing expertise? The doctor shook his head impatiently. No, chirpers with a ch as in chess, he said with an increasing air of distraction. Indeed, as he finished, he was no longer even looking at Romana, but had begun to look around them with concern. Romana quickly identified the source of his worries. The two Time Lords had absent-mindedly wandered a little way from the TARDIS as they chatted, K9 trundling dutifully at their heels. By now they were perhaps 10 meters clear of their vehicle. In the interim, the number of chittids around them had grown dramatically. The Doctor and Romana noticed that both they and the TARDIS were the foci of attention for much high-pitched whispered or muttered discussion. Along with this back and forth between the citizens of City Alpha 1, there were many claws being pointed at either the Doctor, Romana, or the time ship. A single phrase began to stand out, highlighted through repetition. Without understanding why, both Gallifreyans felt an increasing sense of trepidation as they identified these words. The Saviour. The Doctor drew himself up to his full height and sought to calm the crowd by striking up a conversation. Greetings, good citizens of City Alpha 1. We are travelers in search of a friend, Alpha Centauri. Perhaps you might help us find him? This is Romana, my dearest companion. Oh, sorry, K9, you are very dear too. And I am the Doctor. With these final words, his plan to calm the crowd utterly fell apart. Cries of "The Saviour" rang out now from all quarters, no longer whispered or muttered, but squealed in joyous recognition. The excited throng began to press in upon the two time travelers. Romana turned on the Doctor. I thought you said you'd never been here before, she cried desperately as they were both pressed and jostled by those around them. The Doctor threw up his hands in exasperation. I haven't! This must be some terrible mistake. Romana now turned her attention upon the nearest chittids. He's not the Saviour, she insisted crossly. He's a very careless Time Lord. This did nothing to quell the ongoing cries of the Saviour. One of the chittids closest to them, practically in their faces, shrieked, Only the Saviour would deny his divinity. The Doctor rolled his eyes crazily in frustration. Well, what chance does that give me? The first chittid's remark had seemed to spark a philosophical or perhaps theological debate. Actually, it was the companion, the ever-changing one, who denied him, this second chittid declared. There was much muttering from the surrounding crowd, either supporting or doubting this claim, or simply confused. Obviously the companion would speak for the Saviour, the first chittid cried with zealous certainty. What else would you expect? This sparked further furious debate from the surrounding throng. By now the two Time Lords were being jostled quite violently, if unintentionally. The Doctor bent his knees to slide down through the press to be closer to the metal dog. K9, he whispered urgently to him. Master, K9 whispered back. Go back to the TARDIS, get inside and lock the door. Guard protocol, came the Doctor's hushed but barked order. Affirmative, Master. K9's response was still whispered, yet also chirped decisively. His antennae spun and his lights flashed, and it seemed at first he was just as blocked from the time ship as Romana and the Doctor. Then he rose straight up, floating over the heads of the surrounding chittids. It is a sign, someone gasped, which was immediately followed by more sharp intakes of breath and repetitions of the proclamation. You'd have thought a technologically advanced culture like Alpha Centauri would have seen a flying robot before, Romana hissed behind her hand as K9 sat down in front of the doors of the TARDIS. The Doctor leant towards Romana, hand similarly raised to cover his words. Romana, let's not look a gift horse or dog in the mouth, he rasped with as much confidence as he could muster. Run! The crowd furthest from the TARDIS had thinned a little as it had flowed to a degree after the flying dog. This was the direction, away from the TARDIS and through the least dense press of people, that the Doctor now dragged Romana. With judicious use of shoulders and elbows, they successfully burst free of the masses and began to run north. The Saviour is leaving, a voice rang out from the chittid admirers. Wait for us, O Saviour, it continued loudly and shrilly. Lead us! Show us the way! The crowd surged after them, their insectoid legs propelling them with surprising speed. The two Time Lords continued to run through the streets heading, they hoped, for an exit from the city and potential freedom. At the very least, a little privacy in which to gather their thoughts. The universe, it seemed, was in capricious mood today. Another small crowd burst from a side street just in front of them. These citizens were mostly staring at handheld devices. Some of the newcomers looked up and cried, The Saviour! He is here among us! Clearly, social media was spreading news of the Time Lord's arrival faster than they had anticipated or hoped for. The Doctor and Romana ran straight into this new group, unable to halt their momentum in time. The Doctor tripped over a Chittid's foot, flying to the ground, cursing in low Gallifreyan. Romana helped him to his feet, and he cursed some more as he realized he had lost one of his boots. "My DM!" he wailed in frustration and despair. Nevertheless, there was nothing he could do besides allow Romana to drag them both onwards in their continued flight. One of the Chittids behind them had clearly discovered the Doctor's singular item of footwear. "It's a sign," the creature pronounced in the high-pitched tones typical of their race. "Behold the holy shoe," it continued. "Bow down before it. All praise the holy shoe." Many in the crowd began to lower themselves and do exactly that. One of those gathered there upon the road was not so easily distracted, however. They pointed after the fleeing Time Lords and yelled, "Never mind about that. The Saviour's getting away. Follow the Saviour." And so the chase was on again. Fortunately, the farrago with the footwear had allowed the Time Lords to put a little distance between themselves and their pursuers. This was in spite of the Doctor's now uneven gait, one foot still shod whilst the other was only clad in a thick woolen sock. The Doctor consoled himself with the thought that at least the thickness of the woven tube did offer some protection from the hard ground beneath them. The city was walled, a shiny metal barrier whose purpose was not immediately obvious. If it were for defense, it had remarkably large, open and unguarded gates. Indeed, there were no obvious barriers to close and fill the gap. The Doctor and Romana happily took advantage of this and left the metropolis. Ever since they had run from the TARDIS, they had been heading gently uphill. Now free of the city, this ascent persisted as they ran up the dusty road, climbing a hill on the edge of the desert. The runners were still close behind, but as the path curved around the peak of the mound, it did begin to block them from view. As the Time Lords continued their dash under the baking rays of Alpha Centauri A, they saw a small shack on the side of the road ahead, almost resting on the very top of the hill itself. Shack might have been an unkind description. While its size was very much in line with a 1- or 2-room temporary shelter or abode, its materials were high-tech, as one might expect from the technologically adept Alpha Centaurans. In spite of its modest size, all was polished, shining metal and tinted shade-giving glass or similar transparent material. As they ran past this dwelling, the door opened a crack. "Doctor, quickly! In here!" a voice piped out. Romana rolled her eyes. "Is there nowhere you can go and not be recognized?" she demanded exasperatedly. The Doctor ignored this rebuke for the moment and instead turned to face the door. "Alpha Centauri!" he cried excitedly, and not without a little relief. Romana frowned at him. "Yes, Doctor. I know where we are. You don't have to keep repeating yourself." The Doctor turned and shook his head impatiently at her. No, that's not what I mean. I meant—" "Oh, never mind. I'll explain later. Quickly, inside." With that, he ushered his fellow Time Lord towards the door of this metal shack, and they both entered. The Doctor quickly closed the door behind them, and they turned to regard their own personal saviour. As they did so, they heard the sounds of running Chittids approaching the location of the shack, albeit faintly. The soundproofing of their refuge must have been of the highest quality. The Chittid before them looked like many they had seen before, lime-green skin, a veiny cyclopean visage of enormous globular proportions, 4 pairs of bluntly clawed limbs. This particular citizen of Alpha Centauri Prime wore a long, high-collared pleated cloak of the same colour and shade as its hide. The cloak showed a few subtle signs of age, although clearly much loved and cared for. "Alpha Centauri," the Doctor said again with recognition, smiling warmly. Then his face dropped as he noticed Romana's frown of irritation. "Romana, let me introduce you to Ambassador Alpha Centauri of the Galactic Federation." Romana continued to frown at the Doctor. "Very pleased to meet you," she said hurriedly to the Chittid before rounding on her fellow Time Lord. "And why do you keep calling her Alpha Centauri? It's like running into a Dalek and saying, 'Hello, Scaro.' Not only ill-advised, but also imprecise, and possibly a little racially insensitive." "Him," the Doctor corrected brusquely. "And it's what I've always known him as, since we first met." Romana shook her head. "Maybe, Doctor, but you must admit we've already had enough Alpha Centauris floating around in conversation today, along with a mountain of A's, Alphas, Primes, Ones, and what have you. It's hardly conducive to keeping track of people or things." The Doctor shook his head in violent disagreement. "Nonsense! The peoples of Alpha Cent, the Chittids and the Boloids are most systematic individuals, And this is reflected in their nomenclature. For example, there are 6 major cities on the planet, all named in the same fashion as City Alpha 1. Then the next size down are named City Beta 1, 2, 3, etc. All very orderly and easy to remember. Romana sighed and rolled her eyes. Yes, I had heard something about this system's inhabitants being rather nerdy. The doctor shook his head disapprovingly. And there was you accusing me of being insensitive. Romana sighed again. My apologies, Ambassador, she began, conceding the doctor's point a little. Ex-Ambassador, their rescuer chirped in. Okay, ex-Ambassador, Romana continued undeterred. But surely you must have a name beyond your title and your star system. The ex-ambassador nodded in vigorous agreement. Naturally. In my species' native tongue I am known as... What followed was a series of burbling, fluting noises. Romana's eyes rolled skywards in weary defeat. My dear friend, the doctor began, seeking to smooth over the situation. Perhaps to avoid future confusion, we might call you AC? The chitid clapped his pincers together. Of course, Doctor. Whatever is easiest and makes you happy. The doctor and Romana both smiled with relief, albeit for slightly different reasons. Now, AC, the doctor continued, how are you? And why have you retired? You look as young and chipper as when we last met on Peladon. And why are your people chasing us around as if we were some divine visitation? Romana added with some impatience. AC shifted uncomfortably at Romana's question and elected to ignore it for the time being, choosing instead to answer the doctor. You are too kind, Doctor. 75 years have passed since we last met on Peladon, an even longer interlude than that between our last meeting and our first. Believe me when I say I am quite aged enough to retire with honor. True, we are long-lived by your human standards and may show few outward signs, but I am beginning to feel my age. The doctor nodded politely in feigned acceptance of his statement. We're not human, Romana added as an inconsequential correction. Her words, however, provoked a most extreme reaction in their host. He wailed and dropped his head into his uppermost set of claws. Oh, my foolishness! Ever do my own words come back to haunt me? Only now it seems the harm I caused was built on lies. I cannot even be said to have honestly misled my people. What a fool! What an idiot! What a dolt I have been! The doctor and Romana looked at one another in amazement. AC, the doctor cried. My dear, dear friend, what is it? What has upset you so? AC continued to sob, his whole body quivering with emotion. I'm sorry, sir, Romana said softly. I really didn't mean to upset you. The former ambassador looked up at her, and the quivering subsided a little. Beyond that, though, his downcast mood was largely unaltered. There is no need for you to apologize. The only person here who should be sorry is me, and I should be apologizing to the entire planet, if only they would listen. Please, AC, the doctor said, patting his friend's arm. Calm yourself and tell us what it is you think you have done wrong. AC nodded with resigned acceptance. Yes, of course. Now I compound my sins with rudeness. Will my guilt never end? I shall endeavor to answer your question, Doctor, and in the process answer your companions too. Romana, was it? The female Time Lord nodded politely to their chitted host. It all began after my second encounter with the Doctor here, on the planet Peladon, although in truth you could say the initial seeds of doom were sown even from our first meeting. The Doctor could not contain the need to defend himself. But, my dear friend, how can these be the source of disasters? Both those adventures ended happily with plots and deceit uncovered and thwarted. Surely the most positive of outcomes. AC shook his head sadly. Oh yes, your actions were beyond reproach. It was my reporting of them which heralded our current problems. The doctor frowned at him. Your reports? How so? My official reports of both Peladon missions became very popular reading and listening among the public here on Alpha Centauri Prime, particularly my chitted kin. I began to become something of a celebrity, above and beyond my status as ambassador. After the reports of our second adventure became widely known, I was raised in the eyes of many to the rank of chitted hero, something our culture had never really encountered before. The doctor nodded slowly. Yes, I can see how such a novelty could lead to problems, particularly if the situation were abused or taken advantage of, but I can't imagine you'd ever do such a thing. AC nodded vigorously. You imagine correctly, I never would and never did. It was not my status as hero which caused the problems. It was yours. Here the doctor looked shocked and not a little downcast himself. Romana simply nodded knowingly, as if suspicions had been confirmed. I can't imagine anyone would ever see me as a hero, the doctor began. Really? Romana interjected with a raised eyebrow. Not even a little? But, the doctor continued through gritted teeth, even if people did, how would this have caused a problem? AC sighed wearily. The problem was that you became more than just a hero. You became the savior. You gained a status utterly foreign to chitted culture until then. You became the embodiment of the divine. 50 years ago, a religion sprang up around your person, and its popularity has grown ever since, until almost 90% of the chitted population are believers. Now Romana shared the doctor's frown. I can see now how our arrival caused such a stir, and this newfound religious fervor is certainly an odd departure for Alpha Centauran society. But I sense this has caused some further problems you have yet to reveal. And why didn't you try to persuade them that he was not some spiritual entity? She asked. AC looked glum. At first I viewed their excitement at my reports as nothing significant, no problem at all. I was even a little flattered. Naturally, I tried to remind everyone that you were only human. If only I had realized the magnitude of that mistake, and reinforced that he was a brave and good man, performing brave deeds, but nevertheless still just a man. But they wouldn't listen. They almost shunned me for my temerity in belittling their savior. The religion had taken on a life of its own, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. If only I'd known you weren't even human. When my companions and I landed on Peladon, each time everyone we met just assumed we were human, the doctor explained to Romana. And naturally you did nothing to correct this misunderstanding, Romana asked skeptically. Well, the doctor said a little sheepishly, the first time it proved a useful disguise, and by the second visit it was impossible to remove that disguise without creating a diplomatic incident and further complications. Romana nodded sagely. Oh, it is clear no further complications have arisen, she pronounced wryly. The doctor harumphed. Fine. AC, how did my humanity cause later problems? Once more AC shook his head sadly. The people began to associate all humans with your divine status. It was ridiculous. We had been out among the stars long before the first primitive Earth ships made contact. We had been a founder member of the Galactic Federation, which they only later joined. But suddenly they had newfound power and authority over us. They have forced this planet to massively upscale its mining of trisilicate, with disastrous consequences to health and the environment. Romana frowned again. Trisilicate. The doctor shook his own head impatiently. Yes, a compound vital for much of the current technology of the Galactic Federation, including many military devices, invaluable in defending against Galaxy 5. Galaxy 5, Romana sniggered. How quaint. I've not heard that nomenclature in centuries. The doctor brushed her amusement away with a wave of his hand. Yes, all very old school, he said, before turning his full attention on AC. But I didn't even know you had trisilicate on Alpha Centauri Prime. After all, I thought that was the whole point of the negotiations on Peladon in the first place. Here AC looked embarrassed and uncomfortable. Yes, well, we did already have our own supply, but we ensured treaties were enshrined in Federation law limiting the extraction and export of our own reserves to protect our own resources as well as the environment. The doctor gave a wry smile. How very protectionist of you. AC's eye looked towards the floor. Yes, I have no doubt these policies fomented great envy amongst some of our Federation allies, particularly those with no native trisilicate, such as the Earth. Yet again it seems we bring ruination upon ourselves, with no small helping hand from me. I have to show you the devastation the Earthmen are causing, the harsh labor conditions and the laying waste to the jungle. You must come with me and meet Bimbor, chief representative of the Boloids. The doctor and Romana exchanged dubious glances, each sharing similar misgivings as to the effectiveness of this plan. Nevertheless, they felt it hard to ignore the plight of this poor, tortured Chitid and his people, or refuse his request. Of course we will do all we can to help, the doctor said plainly. But how can we get to your Boloid friend when 90% of the Chitid population wish to adore the doctor here? Romana asked. We'd be mobbed as soon as we step outside. AC raised a claw to emphasize his next point. Aha! Yes, you would no doubt be right if we were to step outside. But there is no need. This weather monitoring station, my retirement home as well as my occupation, is mobile. We can fly it to Bimbor's jungle home. Romana nodded slowly. Ah, so this shack is in fact a vehicle. At this, AC looked a little shamed once more. Yes. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. The once proud ambassador reduced to living in a mobile home. The doctor held up a hand to soothe him. Nonsense, there is absolutely nothing wrong with mobile homes, wouldn't you agree, Romana? Romana began to waggle her head skeptically before catching the doctor's frown and morphing it into a vigorous nodded agreement. She also almost successfully hid her smirk. AC moved to a section of wall and pressed a discrete button. The entire surface turned into an array of touchpads and displays, including ones giving views of the outside. The Chittids who had been pursuing the doctor and Romana had long since moved beyond the peak of the hill. They had, for all the Time Lords knew, probably dispersed. However, flying did still seem the surest way of avoiding further obstructions. AC pressed a control, and with the slightest of hums, the shack shot straight up into the air. The two Time Lords had felt no evidence of motion and looked at each other somewhat impressed. "Inertial dampeners," AC explained. "My home, like me, may be getting on a bit, but it was the height of technology in its day." The shack now began to fly south, passing over the glittering metropolis of City Alpha 1 and onto the edge of the jungle. A shudder ran through the vessel. "Oh no!" AC shrieked in panic, waving his claws in the air. "I am a fool! Why didn't I do a systems check first? The mass repulsors are failing!" Romana stared at the doctor. "What does it mean?" she asked desperately. "I believe," the doctor responded grimly. "It means we're going to crash." As if to reinforce his words, the view screen showed the dense jungle rushing up to meet them.
Masters, mistresses, the Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, masters, mistresses.